Senator Moody, followed by Senator Cormier.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Senators Jaffer and Pate, for being here today. As you've pointed out, both pointed out, child welfare is largely under provincial jurisdiction. Can you tell us what you think will be why you chose to bring this at the federal level, and what is the expected impact that this bill would have on the provincial government action in these issues? What's your hope here?
So, Senator Moody, thank you for that question. And you know that our great country has sort of a division of power, and children are under the care of the provinces, but immigration is in the hands of the federal government. So it has to be the federal government who acts, and then that becomes the law for the country. And so that's how this works, is that the federal government has to take the initiative.
Right. And the hope would be that provinces and territories would then therefore instruct their provincial bodies to act responsibly and ensure that children in their care have citizenship, that the appropriate procedures are taken. And this is really a safety net when they don't do that they can't then just deport those kids or those individuals who came as kids.
Senator Cormier, followed by Senator Petitclerc. We are going to go next to Senator Moody, followed by Senator Bernard, followed by Senator Bury.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I'm going to have to admit I'm puzzled by what I'm hearing. And I'm puzzled because I hear, on the one hand, that you have no data. You don't systematically capture, is your language, a lot of the data we're asking about. And when we, in our best efforts to understand possible unintended consequences, we ask that question, what we're given are what sound like hypothetical but highly improbable, I use my colleagues' words, scenarios. So I want to dig a little bit more into these anecdotal types of encounters that you are quoting as your evidence for why this bill should not proceed. I'm wondering and trying to get at what is the scope of this problem that you described as your example, and perhaps there are other examples that fall in this category. I'm trying to understand the scope here. So I'm wondering if in your conversations, these conversations you have with the provinces, where they get in touch with you to say this is happening, do you record these conversations? And is there some way we can retrieve numbers so that we actually can understand perhaps some of the scope of these problems, the alignment of these problems, to see if there's actually any support for what you're saying? I'm sorry, but I have to throw this out there because in my world as a physician, I wouldn't get away with talking about one example. I don't think you get away with that either. I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you for that. And thank you for not letting me get away with it. And I appreciate the question because I'd like to clarify two aspects. So one is in relation to our position today, and in terms of answering questions and putting forward and we tried to be very careful with our language around perceive as potential unintended consequences, is really to make sure that we are putting forward, as we read the information, what could potentially happen. It is not our statement or our position that any of these will happen, and because it's a bit, that part of what is being proposed in the legislation is not there right now, I would not have data of how many cases would meet those potential criteria. The question around data of persons in care and who are not Canadian citizens, who are not informed of their status at the time that they age out of care, is much more about what is the current situation and what is currently happening under existing legislation. So I'd like to just clarify that those are two distinct aspects, and it's not a correlation of an example, therefore that is what could happen here. With regards to data, we do have some data. The issue around the data and the complexity and the challenge is that we don't have the cohesive data set of when children are in care and their immigration status, which would be whether they're a foreign national, a permanent resident, or a Canadian citizen. It's that amalgamation of the data sets that is unavailable. We do know from stakeholders and others that there's currently approximately 50 referrals per year for children, youth, and young adults who are seeking assistance with gaining their Canadian citizenship. And that was from the Child Welfare Immigration Centre of Excellence in Ontario. In addition, we know in terms of unaccompanied minors who arrive in Canada each year, we don't know how many are unaccompanied when they arrive, because it could be that their parent was on the same flight. Their parent could be arriving on the very next flight. However, what we do know is from the Immigration Refugee Board, there were 915 unaccompanied minor refugee claimant applications between 2016 and 2022. What we cannot say is how many of these unaccompanied minors were in the care of Child Protective Services at a certain point in time. So it's that amalgamation of the data that is challenging for us. Thank you.
Madam Chair, one question, follow-up. So I guess I also listened very carefully to Mr. Mercer. You made a comment that design and implementation plan would be something you'd have to work on. And I'm assuming that's where you would include in that a way to capture the appropriate data should this become law. Did I get that right?
Yes, thank you for the question. Of course, we would look at designing the necessary framework around implementation. And I think if I may, just to touch on the question that you asked previously, I think it's precisely like the example that I gave in the opening remarks around a person who doesn't consent to acquisition of citizenship when there's an issue with dual citizenship. I think that type of scenario just procedurally is probably likely to occur because precisely as been the discussion, some of these individuals won't know there's an issue with their citizenship until they've been put in the criminal justice system and until they find out that there's an issue with their citizenship. And sequentially, immigration enforcement tends to precede the citizenship process. And so I think while we don't have data on how often that's going to happen, just understanding how the continuum works, it's not necessarily an unlikely scenario that might arise.
Thank you very much. We must go on. We'll come back to second round. Senator Bernard, followed by Senator Bury. Senator Moody.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to, if I can, just continue to explore. We were just talking about dual citizenship, I think, is where we left off. Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to talk a little bit more and understand that a little bit more. I've heard this raised as a reason for why children who are in care and come to that stage where proposal is they'd get automatic citizenship might somehow encounter some sort of moral or other catastrophe of deciding which country they want to be in. This is the only country they've known. This is where they grew up. They don't know anybody else. They're being returned to a place where nobody knows them, and they would be struggling to find a footing with no supports. If that question can be asked of them, why wouldn't it be the starting point? And why is that being placed as a serious consideration or a serious barrier?
Thank you for the question. So if I understand correctly, you're asking why, as a matter of course, for immigration enforcement, we wouldn't ask everyone.
No, I'm asking why that's being used as a reason to say that this is automatic citizenship would be a problem. Because perhaps they'd be renouncing, through that process, another citizenship that they might in some way value. Again, we're into what is real and what here is hypothetical. I mean, I have dual citizenship. I can tell the world that.
Yes, if I could, I'll take the question from my colleague for this one. So the consideration for us in that space is tied to not all countries recognize or allow dual citizenship. For some countries, they do not recognize or allow for dual citizenship.
26. I just counted.
Yes. And so the perceived concern in that space is tied to how the bill positions automatic citizenship. So it comes back to if upon royal assent, everyone who meets the criteria are automatically Canadian citizens. It's that initial step of choosing not to relinquish their other citizenship.
Thank you. If I may ask a question on the retroactivity interpretation that you provided to us.
Thank you, Chair.
To Moody.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you very much for being here today, Fatuma, especially to you. I want to address my question to Mr. Brough. I want to follow up on these unintended consequences just a little bit more. One particular one. It was noted to us by the officials that automatic citizenship may cause problems for those who still hold citizenship in another country, a country that doesn't allow dual citizenship. Can you talk about that to us? I know you talk about a voluntary process, an application process. That does come with some problems, access, education, being able to navigate, and so on. So if you could talk a little bit about the challenge of the process as well.
Sure. Thank you very much. And I will ask my colleagues to jump in if there's anything in addition. But the question of voluntariness and loss of status, I guess the first response to that is whether this provision remains a grant by right or citizenship by right or is shifted to Section 5. Either way, there's a step that needs to be taken by the individual to obtain that citizenship, right? Even if it's by right, the individual would need to make an application for a certificate of citizenship. So they are taking a step. A question about getting proper, advice before making that step, that's obviously very important. We work in legal clinics and we can, talk about how to provide that. But that's the first answer to the issue that was raised by the government. I don't think it's a real concern, frankly, from my perspective.
Can I just add a follow-up quickly? What about the problem that we encounter and that Fatuma has encountered, which is no paperwork? How do we get around that if we do put a system like this in place?
Well, to some degree, paperwork is going to be required one way or the other. And what you see in the bill is a specific provision to try to get around barriers for paperwork, right? There's a requirement there that the government must rely on a statement by the individual unless there's evidence to the contrary. If the person states that they were in care for a year, that should be enough. As a matter of law, if you pass the bill as formed here, you are getting rid of very significant normal barriers that most applicants have to deal with. You wanted to jump in?
Only just to say as well that in many other parts of our immigration work, when documentation, when security issues arise, our immigration services routinely will waive. If they're satisfied with what's been provided, they will waive. So that idea that that's not already happening is not true. It happens all the time.
Follow Senator Moody, followed by Senator Cormier.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to the officials for being here today. Terence, it's good to see you. I want to focus on the question of, you are Peeled Children's Aid Society. I'm a pediatrician. I know how children get taken from their families. You guys have a role in this, right? At the same time, you intimately seem to understand the issue faced by children that age out. What's the failure rate in Mississauga, where you sit? And why do you have this failure rate, despite this incredible amount of information you have, resources and focus?
can speak to that. One of the things that we're doing as a system in Ontario is really looking at how we redesign child welfare. And, you know, the way I describe it is it's a move from a sole focus of child protection to child, youth, and family well-being. And so that's invested in early help and intervention, working with ethnocultural partners to be able to change and redesign the system so that we are not bringing children into care. We know the outcomes of that. We want to keep them at home in their communities. What I can proudly say in terms of Peel Region is despite our size of being 1.5 million, we have less than 150 children in care. That's because of the programs, that's because of the work that we do with community. And what I'll say is the work of CWICE, because we have had this program, this working for us for the past 5 years, we are not seeing children leave our care without having citizenship addressed, or at least a process to start that. And what we wanted to do, having Pearson International Airport in our jurisdiction, and because we had to build this expertise, because we were seeing newcomers and new arrivals come into Peel and not being able to do that, we didn't want to have a different experience for a child in Sudbury or in another part of Ontario that children and youth in our region were getting the benefit for. So really, we became a center of excellence designated by other children's aid societies in Ontario to help do this work. And we're starting to see those shifts because we're able to do that. We talked about the teaching they do. They talked about the service provision they do. And one of the last things I'll say is part of the role of the Child Welfare Immigration Center of Excellence is to make sure that any child or youth who've left us have the opportunity to come back. It's our commitment to say, if we failed you before, we will be here and help to navigate that process. It's why we're advocating for Bill S-235 to help us do that and to make that process easier.
So quick follow-up is Toronto sits right beside you. One of the biggest areas of issue. Tell me how you've helped them, and really, what's the issue? Is it funding, and your message is not spreading because your teaching, your expertise is not available to them? They're right beside you.
May I answer that?
Yes.
Social workers typically are there to provide social work, but they're not versed on immigration issues. Very often, we see files where no one has looked at it for years and years and years. Nobody has made that a part of the child's file. It has changed with the redesign. It is now obligatory to have a look at that, to have documents for each child in Ontario. I can speak for other provinces, but we are changing. We are making roadways.
Do you have the data?
I'll refer that to Danielle.
We have some data. We don't have probably the type of data that you're hoping for in terms of the exact numbers.
Senator Cormier, followed by Senator Burnett.